First of all, if we look at the contract, there is no damages remedy in the contract. The contract, if it is completely silent on what is to happen if there is a breach of a code of conduct, then you can refer to default law, which is the CISG. Why the CISG is default law, I'm not going to tell you. That's because it's the homework, so you're going to find out by yourself. But I can tell you the result. It is the default law. So the CISG is default law, and default law, as you have all learned, only becomes relevant if the contract is silent. But the contract is not silent in our case. It says something that is supposed to happen if we have a breach of contract. Somebody following me? And oh yes, I'm afraid I'm going to share the screen for those who are streaming. I'm going to write a couple of things on the whiteboard. I am aware that you cannot see that, but I will try to express everything in words so that you can follow. I'll share the screen with you right now so that you can see the contract. So here, in section 7.3, it says the supplier that is responsible for the performance of its factories producing commercial products. Critical violations in any factory will result in immediate termination of the factory. If we have a violation of the standards, what is to happen according to the contract? Not damages, but the termination of the factory. End it. That's, as we say in German. That's the end of the story. If this is the exclusive remedy, the case is over. We don't even have to discuss if there's enough evidence. We don't have to think about whether NX-Hain has been used or not. Some arbitrators will say, oh, great, this is the exclusive remedy. The case is easy. It's dismissed. You understand that? This is really the only thing you can do if there is a breach of a supplier code of conduct. There is no case for the claimant. So that's the first question that has to be solved. Is 7.3 an exclusive remedy? Remedy, remember, is a right. We're talking about the right. And the right here is to kick out one subcontractor or one factory, as the contract says. If it is an exclusive remedy, yes, case is over. Case over. Claimant loses. Okay? If not, what could be the argument that it is not an exclusive remedy? The argument would be it doesn't say so. It doesn't say that this is the exclusive remedy. Sometimes contracts specify that the contractual remedies are exclusive and exclude, indeed, any kind of remedy that is in default law. That would be the only argument that the claimant could then raise against this. I've seen that we had much of the discussions this afternoon, we didn't have very much this discussion. Okay, it was difficult to find. If it is not an exclusive remedy, indeed, we then come to the very messy business of having to establish whether or not there is a breach of contract. Then the case becomes complicated. Knowing that arbitrators like to have a simple solution, they might rule in favor of the respondent here. But no, if we think it's not an exclusive remedy, we have indeed Article 74, or as one group said, Article 45 refers to Article 74. So indeed, we have here a damages claim. And what do you have to, as a claim, what do you have to show? You have to show a breach. And this afternoon, almost all the discussions were focusing on whether there was a breach of contract or not. Most of the claimants very well demonstrated that, first of all, a breach by a supplier subcontractor is attributed to the supplier. That is mentioned in the contract. I think it's 7.5. Huh? So many claimants saw that. It's very good. So if there is a breach by a subcontractor, it is attributed to the supplier. Okay, well, now the question is, did the subcontractor breach the contract? And there, indeed, it becomes very difficult to prove something. What do we have? First, the issue about NX-Hain. NX-Hain, there were traces of NX-Hain. Some respondents very well argued, well, traces of NX-Hain doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that, indeed, NX-Hain was used in the production process. Some claimants argued quite well that it doesn't matter if it's there, it has been used. So indeed, the presence of N-hexane is very thin evidence. At the same time, an arbitration tribunal can be satisfied with this kind of evidence. We're not in a criminal tribunal where you have to have evidence beyond reasonable doubt. You can evaluate evidence as sufficient. I admit it's very thin, but possibly an arbitrator might say that there is sufficient evidence for the use of N-hexane production process. So possibly it could be a breach because it's clearly banned in the contract. The second argument is is work hours, 16 hours. If you look into the code of conduct, I think the code of conduct is not a good one. If you want to ensure the respect of basic labor rights in your supply chain, the code of conduct is very limited because it doesn't mention working hours. It just mentions health and safety. No word about working hours. So the only way you can say that the 16 hours breached the code of conduct is that they resulted in a health and safety risk. That is why some of the discussions we had, there were some good arguments saying that if you work 16 hours, you might increase the risk of an accident. With this kind of argument, only with this kind of argument will you succeed with the 16 working hours. Otherwise, the working hours are not mentioned in the code of conduct. Risk of accident. That is the only way to argue in favor of a breach, if you want. Then some of you mentioned 8.2 of the contract that a reporter was allowed on the premises. Well, the reporter was not allowed on the premises. And 8.2 talks about permits. There was one group that pointed that out. So very well. So no, indeed, the contract says you're not allowed to permit somebody on the premises, and here not prevent. Okay. So 8.2 will probably not work. So with these two arguments, possibly you can say that there's a breach of contract. But then you still have a next problem. Which one? Look at Article 74, what you still have to do, even if we can establish a breach.
Evaluate the losses.
Yeah, well, even if you can evaluate the losses, of course, some claimants were very good at that to substantiate why they have had the losses that they're claiming that you have to do, but you still have to prove the causality.
We foresee at the time.
The foreseeability is something else. That is in Article 25 of the CISG for fundamental breach, that the parties could foresee that at the time of the conclusion of the contract that was foreseeable. 74 is indeed a foreseeable. Yeah, that's Article 74 you're referring to. At the time of the contract, so the amount of damages, very good. So we'll come back to that later on. So the causality, indeed, first we have to establish causality, and then could this have been foreseen? Could this causal link have been foreseen at the time of the conclusion of the contract? That is what Article 74 is asking the parties to show. Causality. What are you claiming? You're claiming that this has led to a major loss of reputation and loss of sales. Well, the direct cause of a loss of sales is what? Consumers are not buying your products. That's the cause. And not some kind of subcontractor somewhere in China possibly using N-hexane. It's not. The direct cause is consumer behavior. When it comes to reputation, it can be all kinds of causes that cause damage to the reputation. So it will be very difficult to establish causality. There's one thing I would like to point out in law, causality is not understood as pure scientific causality. Possibly here we could say, well, had there, like a little bit like condicio sine qua non, had there not been this journalistic report, then there would have never been a reputation damage. However, at one point, you have to limit the causality normatively. I'll give you an illustration from other type of cases that, believe it or not, happen in every country. that illustrate the fact that causality, so the responsibility, liability for your actions that you have caused and the consequences that you caused has to be kept somewhere. This is the case that you find in any kind of jurisdiction that happens everywhere. So you have a construction company, different case. You have a construction company working at the outskirts of a city, digging new foundations, whatever. And there are power cables that are serving a whole city, a major power cable. And now they make a mistake, small negligence, they cut the power cable. And the whole city has a blackout. Millions of damage. So all factories working in the city can't produce their goods, and companies can't do their business. And so people have huge damages claims. Can they all go against the construction company? Scientifically, it has caused the whole damage. But can they all sue the company? Probably not. The causality, though, scientifically given, will be legally limited. And there are various expressions for that. In UK law, you would say it's too remote. The cause is too remote of the damage. In Germany, we would say it's not adequate. So there are various ways to limit the responsibility for causal actions. And that could be used here somewhat. You could say even if there is a breach, it might have led to a partial loss of sales, but it cannot be the sole cause for the whole reputational loss, the whole brand value of the company that the claimant, some of the claimant groups have been trying to recuperate. You can't put it in different words. You can't ask from a medium-sized supplier to ensure the brand value of a retailer. You just can't do that. It's just not fair. It's just completely would be a complete unfair distribution of risk, and it doesn't show in the contract. The contract shows, on the contrary, that when there is a problem with the supplier contract that the parties will get together and try to solve the issues. And that, by the way, is how you should go about these things, because there are maybe many problems in supply chains. The world is as it is. There are breaches even of very fundamental rights in all kinds of supply factories. There are breaches of environmental standards everywhere. And we're not going to change the world from one day to the other. The best way to do that, I guess, is to have a close relationship with your supplier and work on the failures and try to improve them over time. But if there's one failure and then you start trying to recuperate your entire brand value, hitting at the supplier, that will not work. Okay? So I think that any arbitrator in this case, probably they would already kick out the claim because of this being an exclusive remedy. If they ever accepted that Article 74 could be applicable, they might say, okay, the evidence thin, but it might be sufficient because of the working hours is not disputed, that might be okay. But the damages claim would be lowered. It would be significantly lower. That would be my prediction, how the case would work out. What do we learn from that for business practice? One important thing is to realize that contracts are limited when it comes to dealing with these issues. I think it is important to use a contract. I think you should, as if you're a buyer and you want to do due diligence and ensure sustainability standards in your contract, why not use supplier code of conduct? It's not a bad thing to do, but don't expect too much of it. So you use the supplier code of conduct, and what is much more important than relying on the law to cover your risks is to engage with the supplier, that the supplier understands that it's important, and the supplier also joins you in the idea of producing goods and respecting fundamental rights in the environment. You can, to some extent, cover your risks, but it would, again, be exaggerated to believe that you can cover your entire brand reputation and shift that risk to your suppliers. That's probably not going to work. All right. From the supplier's point of view, it might be difficult. You might be bothered by these. You might be scared by these supplier code of conducts. You don't know, especially if you have to, like this clause is very, very nasty for suppliers. 7.5. You're also responsible for your own suppliers. That might be very difficult. You might not have the means to do the same kind of due diligence that the retailer is doing. You just might not have the power to do that, but it could be that you have no choice. Yeah? That you have your supplier, you have to take it or leave it. In that case, indeed, you have also your own, as a supplier, you also have, to some extent, have the responsibility to do your own due diligence. That might cost. And you just have to be aware of that when you accept these kind of contracts, even if you think you have no choice. It's all very difficult. And I think these kind of situations will increase, especially if in the European Union we have this kind of due diligence. So that not only companies that want to appear as very ethical in the marketplace, well, no, every company in the European Union will have to do this kind of thing. So that's my brief feedback on the case, what I think about it. Yeah.
So as a supplier, the power position is already has the gap. How can we do this kind of situation?
Yeah.
To avoid the fully liability for our subcontractor.
Well, indeed, it's very good that you point out how you manage the risks while you execute the contracts. I would say in the situation here, in this case, a wise move would have just been to if you don't have the production capacities and you know you're putting strain on your factories, you might know that you're engaging in a possible risk of breaching, whatever working hours or other fundamental rights that are provided in the supplier contract. Just say we can't do it. And you have a good excuse because you have the COVID. At that time, you could still use that as a force majeure argument. So probably would have been wise to say, we can't do it. It would have been the honest response. Excuse me?
It was kind of a conundrum because the company kept saying, no, we can't. And they were like, no, you have to do it. So I guess the company was afraid of paying the fine because that would be like right away. So then
would it be right away?
Do it with the help of trade out.
Well, I think that a company, again, and some of you mentioned it, that's the third argument. I didn't mention it here. It's good that you pointed out. If everything fails so if the respondent really wants to have a third line of defense, it would be the good faith argument. Some of you saw Article 80 of the CFD. The good faith argument is the last straw. And you can say that on the one hand, the claimant wants to appear as an ethical company and wants to respect that there's a respect of the supplier code of conduct. At the same time, it behaves contradictorily, saying, well, now you fulfill our order. It seems to be the contradictory behavior that you could try to make a bad faith argument out of this. But I would use this really as a last resort because it's very difficult to convince the arbitrator. Arbitrators don't like to touch these bad faith arguments because it's very difficult to argue. Yeah.
In front of the arbitrator, if there is a situation where the pertinent law, say where in this case we were going to the law of France, Republic of France, and the code of conduct somehow doesn't align, then in that case what arbitrator should what is his position?
Code of conduct doesn't align.
Maybe contradicting on some code of conduct, like it's there in the contract, but it doesn't really align with the law.
Well, first of all, the contract is governed by the laws of France, the sales contract, just as the provisions. So the default law would be French law, but it's the CISC. So that's up to you to find out why it's the CISC and not French, not the French civil code. I'm not telling you because that's part of the whole. Okay, so the default law would be a French law, but that doesn't apply, for example, to the working conditions. With this, you can't elect the working conditions of your suppliers.
Yeah.
That is not up to you. It's not the French buyer who can determine what are the working conditions at the Chinese seller. The working conditions are according to Chinese law. What you're trying to do with the code of conduct is you're trying to make the supplier aware that the company is very sensitive to the respect of fundamental rights throughout the supply chain. And you refer to basic international standards like the core conventions of the International Labour Organization. Some of these conventions have been ratified by China, not all of them, but I think a couple of them have been ratified by China. But that doesn't matter because there you're referring to a text, you're trying to some extent have an influence on the production standards in your supply chain, which is justified because consumers are looking at that. So you have a certain risk as a retailer. You want to cover that risk, and the supplier code of conduct can be one tool to address that risk. It is, however, a limited tool. Don't expect that you can bank your whole brand reputation on this. I don't think so. Any other questions?
It's more like a curiosity question. Let's say the arbitrator rules against the company. Can you enforce arbitration rule in China?
Yes, you can. China, in principle, yes. In China, you can has ratified the New York Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Arbitral Awards, and to my knowledge, China has been enforcing arbitration awards. However, it is up to any party to, if you want to challenge the arbitration award, the only thing you can do is to say that the arbitration process was unfair, or that the arbitrator was biased, or had a conflict of interest, or so. Then you're going to succeed. As you can, in many parties who lose, often try to challenge the arbitration award. It's not only China; it's also France was a long time. Indeed, until a couple of years ago, France even had a lot of more possibilities for parties to challenge arbitration awards. It was even more hostile to arbitration than China is. Meanwhile, France has become more friendly to them. So arbitration works. Of course, if another advice, probably easier. Now I forgot the institution. Chinese Chamber of Commerce, or there is a Chinese arbitration service that is probably easier to use if you want to do business in China, and it might be easier to enforce their awards. But the ICC arbitration is also enforceable if it's well done.
So, suppose the arbitration you cannot appeal, you will have to start a second process.
There's no appeal in arbitration. No, what we're talking, once you have an arbitration award, it's final. What you can do, that was the question here, what you can do then is you can challenge at the moment of the enforcement. So if the respondent doesn't pay the money, despite the arbitral award, then you're going to try to use your piece of paper, go to the Chinese court, say, declare this award enforceable so that we can use the help of the Chinese government to collect our money. So that the Chinese court would have to declare, recognize the arbitral award on the basis of the New York Convention and declare it enforceable. And only then do you get the money. A long way still to go.
And they've been doing it in your experience.
Yes, China has been enforcing arbitral awards. The Chinese business depends on very much on the integrity of arbitration, or else there's no way to sort out legal disputes. People might shy away from doing business with Chinese companies. So it's vital for the Chinese economy to get along, I guess. But there can be ways to challenge arbitral awards, and that also has been tried very often. Any other? Yeah.
Nobody else can.
Yeah.
Can you expand a bit more on the role of the COVID in this case? Because
yeah.
What I was personally get confused is that how could you be liable if you're locked down in Hubei?
Yeah.
I
don't want to say too much because there is an exam question on that. Why force majeure is not relevant? So how can I put this without saying too much? Well, the COVID lockdown is a good background to this case, and I think that it can justify a bad faith argument because of the difficult situation that the claimant must know that it can't force or try to force the supplier to do all kinds of things. So I think that could be how COVID becomes relevant in this case. But I think you don't even get there. I think in most arbitrators, the whole discussion would be about interpretation of the contract. Is 7.3 an exclusive remedy or not? Because all the other questions, evidence, it's very messy. It's not clear. Bad faith, not clear. So that full of legal ambiguities that could be avoided if we had a clear decision on this point. Okay, any other issues, questions? Okay, hope that you had some fun with the arbitration case. And we'll see each other, by the way, in a very small session with you on data ethics. Another thing I'd like to do very much. We'll see you then. Okay, bye. Could the people who streamed the session